bullet missed his skull by 4 inches, and the only reason Alessio Contini was still breathing was a woman he had known for exactly 6 days. She moved before the sound of the shot had finished traveling across the courtyard, her shoulder driving into his chest, both of them crashing behind the stone fountain as the second round chipped marble an inch from where his head had been. He hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of him, and the first thing he registered, before the pain, before the shouting, before his men came pouring out of the house with weapons drawn, was the weight of her body over his, deliberate, absorbing the angle of fire, so that if a third shot came, it would find her spine before it found him. Nobody had done that for him in 11 years. Not since his father died. He lay there under her, staring up at a face he had dismissed 4 days earlier as unremarkable, and understood, in the cold clarity that follows near death, that he had been wrong about her from the very first conversation. Her name was Wren Ashford. She was 29 years old, 5'6", with the kind of face that photographed forgettably and disappeared into a crowd within seconds, which was precisely why she had been recommended for the job. Alessio's previous head of personal security, a man named Dario, who had been with the Contini family for 19 years, had been shot dead in a hotel garage in Baton Rouge 3 weeks earlier, and the man who replaced him lasted 4 days before Alessio fired him for incompetence, bordering on insult. When his consigliere, an old, careful man named Emmanuel Ruiz, suggested a woman for the position, Alessio had laughed once, dryly, and said that was the worst idea he'd heard all year. Emmanuel had not argued. He had simply placed a folder on the desk and walked out, and 3 hours later, Alessio was still sitting with it closed in front of him, because Emmanuel Ruiz did not waste his time on jokes. If you enjoy stories about power, obsession, and the kind of woman who is never what she appears to be, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the Mafia boss stories before we go further. And tell me in the comments, would you have trusted her on day 1, or would you have sent her away? Because Alessio Contini almost did exactly that. He read the folder that night. There wasn't much in it. A private security contractor's license, a short employment history with a firm that handled protection details for shipping executives and foreign officials passing through the Gulf Coast. No family listed beyond a brother, incarcerated, sentence unspecified. No photographs that made her look like anything other than tired. He remembered thinking, closing the folder, that Emmanuel had lost his instincts in his old age. And then he remembered, because he made himself remember everything, it was the only way a man survived in his world past 40, that Emmanuel had never once been wrong about a person in the 15 years Alessio had known him. She started on a Tuesday. She didn't introduce herself with a handshake or a speech about her qualifications. She walked the perimeter of the house twice before she said a single word to him, and when she finally did speak, it wasn't to him. It was to his driver, quietly informing him that the hedge along the east wall needed to be cut back 18 inches because it currently gave a shooter a clean sightline to the pool terrace from the street. Alessio, standing at the window above them, watched his driver's face change from irritation to something closer to respect, and felt the first small crack in his certainty that this had been a mistake. She did not talk unless she had something worth saying, and when she did speak, her voice never rose, never softened into flattery, never performed the deference that everyone else around him performed instinctively, the way water finds the lowest point in a room. Alessio Contini was used to being managed. Every person in his orbit, from his lieutenants to the women who wanted to be seen on his arm at the right restaurants, managed him, softened their opinions, read his mood before they spoke, told him what he wanted to hear, wrapped in just enough resistance to seem honest. Wren Ashford did none of that. On her second day, when he told her he intended to attend a dinner at a restaurant on Magazine Street, without additional security, because he was tired of being watched every minute of his life. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "Then you'll die somewhere with good lighting and worse pasta, and I'll have failed at my job in under a week. Your call." Then she said nothing else, and let the silence sit there until he changed his mind. Nobody talked to him like that. Nobody except his mother, who had been dead 6 years, and the memory of that particular flavor of directness landed somewhere in his chest he had thought was permanently sealed off. By the end of the first week, he had started watching her the way he watched everyone, cataloging, assessing, looking for the angle, the tell, the thing she wanted from him that she hadn't said out loud yet. Everyone wanted something. That was the first law of his world, the one his father had taught him before he was old enough to understand why it needed teaching. But Wren didn't seem to want anything. She didn't linger near the parts of the house where the money was discussed. She didn't ask questions about his business beyond what she needed to plan a route or secure a room. She ate her meals standing, usually near an exit, and she declined, twice, invitations from his men to join them for drinks after a long shift, in a tone that closed the subject without making an enemy of anyone who'd asked. It was the courtyard shooting, 6 days in, that changed the shape of everything. The shooter had been positioned on the roof of a shuttered laundromat 2 properties down, a distance and angle that even Alessio's trained security team had judged, incorrectly, to be outside effective range for the kind of amateur hit they'd been braced for since Dario's murder. Wren had judged differently. She had flagged the laundromat roofline on her second day and asked, twice, for it to be added to the perimeter sweep. She had been told, politely, that the budget for additional patrols didn't extend that far. When the first shot came, she was already moving, because she had spent 6 days memorizing exactly how many steps it would take to get from her position by the pool to the blind side of the fountain, in case the thing she had warned them about ever happened. In the chaos afterward, his men securing the perimeter, sweeping the laundromat roof, and finding it empty except for 2 spent casings and a boot print in the gravel. Emmanuel Ruiz arriving pale and furious, demanding answers nobody had. Alessio sat on the edge of the fountain with a coat someone had thrown over his shoulders, and watched Wren give a clipped, precise account of the timeline to the men securing the scene, her hands perfectly steady, even though there was a shallow gash along her forearm from where marble shrapnel had caught her when she put herself between him and the second shot. She didn't mention the wound. He was the one who noticed it, blood running thin and dark down to her wrist, and something in him, something old, something he associated with being a much younger man, before the version of himself that ran a criminal empire had calcified into place, made him stand up and take her arm without asking permission, turning it over to look at the cut. "You're bleeding," he said, and it came out lower than he intended, rougher. "I'm aware," she said. She didn't pull her arm away, but she didn't lean into the touch either. She just watched him, that same steady, unreadable calm, while blood ran between his fingers. "You should go inside. There could be a second team." "There isn't," he said, because he'd already had 2 men confirm it, and because some part of him didn't want the conversation to end yet, standing there with her pulse under his fingers, her arm the only unguarded, undefended thing about her that he'd been allowed to touch. "Why did you push me instead of yourself?" It was a strange question to ask, in retrospect. The answer was obvious. It was her job. She was paid to absorb exactly that kind of risk. Any competent bodyguard would have done the same. But he asked it anyway, and she looked at him for a beat too long before she answered, like she was deciding how honest to be. "Because you're the one they were aiming at," she said, "not me." It wasn't an answer that explained anything, and it was, somehow, the only answer that mattered. That night, for the first time since he'd taken over the family at 26, Alessio Contini lay awake, not running numbers on shipments, or replaying old grievances with the Delacroix family across the river. but thinking about the particular stillness in a woman's face when she'd said, "Not me," like the distinction should have been self-evident, like her own life had simply not entered into the calculation at all. He didn't like that it bothered him. He didn't like that anything about her bothered him. In his world, attachment was a door left open, and doors left open were how men like him ended up like Dario, or like his father, bleeding out on a marble floor because someone had found the one soft place in an otherwise armored life and put a knife through it. He told himself, lying there, that what he felt was gratitude, professional respect, nothing more complicated than a man being glad his security hadn't gotten him killed. He almost believed it. 3 days after the shooting, a name came back from the investigation into the roof of the laundromat. A low-level enforcer named Curtis Boyle, formerly employed, loosely, deniably, by the Delacroix family, found 2 days later in the trunk of his own car outside Metairie, which meant someone had cleaned up the loose end before Alessio's people could interrogate him. That told Alessio two things. First, that the Delacroix family, or someone claiming to act for them, had decided the ceasefire that had held for 4 uneasy years was no longer worth honoring. Second, that whoever had arranged the hit had resources and reach inside his own city that made the amateur nature of the actual shooting deeply suspicious, as if the shooter had been sent to fail, to test something, rather than to succeed. Emmanuel Ruiz did not like that theory. Emmanuel Ruiz liked it even less when, going through Dario's old files 2 weeks later trying to understand what his predecessor might have missed, Alessio found a name he didn't recognize, cross-referenced against a burner number that had called Dario's phone 4 times in the week before his murder, and the same number appeared, once, in a call log belonging to someone currently living inside Alessio's own house. He didn't tell anyone what he'd found. Not yet. He sat with it for 2 days, turning the rook-shaped chess piece he'd kept in his coat pocket since he was 9 years old, a habit from watching his father play against himself in the study late at night, working through the possibilities, the way his father had worked through openings and endgames. There were only a handful of people inside the house with access to a landline that routed through the family's private exchange. Emmanuel was one. His younger brother, Nico, who ran the docks and had never quite forgiven Alessio for being the one their father chose, was another. And Wren Ashford, whose desk in the security office had a phone on it that she rarely used because she preferred her own cell, except that the log showed a call placed from that exact extension at 2:14 in the morning to a number that, when Alessio finally paid a specialist to trace it properly, connected back to a federal field office 3 states away. The floor didn't just crack that night. It opened. He confronted her the way he confronted everyone who had ever betrayed him. Cold, controlled, giving nothing away until the moment he needed to. He called her into the study at 11 at night, told his men to wait outside, and set the phone log on the desk between them without a word. He watched her read it. He watched her go very still, the particular stillness of someone deciding, in real time, whether a lie was still possible. "I want the truth," he said. "Once. I won't ask twice, and I won't be lenient with a second version if the first one turns out to be wrong." She didn't reach for a lie. That, more than anything else, was what kept him from calling the 2 men waiting outside the door. "My brother is in federal custody," she said. 11 years. Mandatory minimum. A case that should have been 6. 4 months ago, a man from the U.S. Attorney's Office came to see me and told me they could get that number down to 3 if I took a security contract that happened to be opening up in your household, and reported back anything I learned about shipments moving through your docks. I said no. He came back a second time and told me my brother's next parole hearing would go a lot better if I changed my answer. I said yes, because I didn't have a version of myself that could say no twice and live with it. She held his gaze without flinching. I called that number once, from your house line, 4 months ago, before I ever met you, to confirm the terms in writing, because I don't trust men who make promises over drinks. I have not called it since. I have not sent a single piece of information about your business to anyone. Ask your specialist to trace every call from that line for the last 4 months, if you don't believe me. There's one call, and it's the one you're holding. And Dario, Alessio said. The 4 calls to his phone, the week before he died. Something in her face changed then. Not fear, but a different kind of tension. The look of someone approaching a piece of truth she genuinely hadn't wanted to hand him. I didn't know Dario, she said, but I'd bet everything I have that whoever called him wasn't asking him to inform for the government. The federal case against your organization is thin, Mr. Contini. It's been thin for years. That's not why he's dead. And it's not why someone put a man with a rifle on a laundromat roof 2 properties from your pool. She paused. I think someone wanted you looking at Washington so you wouldn't look across the river. He wanted to believe she was lying, because it would have been easier, cleaner, a wound he understood the shape of, betrayal being a familiar country he'd lived in his whole life. But nothing about the way she said it fit the shape of a lie. He had spent 17 years learning to read men and women who lied to him for a living, and Wren Ashford, sitting across the desk with her hands flat and visible, and her voice never once climbing toward persuasion, was not one of them. Why tell me any of this, he said quietly, instead of just letting me find the one call and assume the worst? Because I'd rather you know exactly what I am, she said, than trust a version of me that isn't real. Before we go further, if this story has you gripped, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories. And let me know in the comments, if you were Alessio, sitting across that desk, would you have believed her? He didn't sleep that night either. He sat in the study long after she left, turning the confession over, the way he turned the chess piece, looking for the crack in it, and finding none. What he found instead, unwelcome and undeniable, was that some part of him had already decided to believe her before she finished the sentence. Not because the evidence demanded it, but because some quieter, older part of him wanted, badly, for it to be true. He didn't fire her. He didn't report the conversation to a manual either, which was its own kind of confession, because in 17 years he had never once kept something this significant from the one man he trusted completely. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He gave her more access, not less. He told her 2 days later that he was moving up the timeline on a shipment coming through the Eastern Dock, a decision that only 4 people in the world were supposed to know about, and he watched, over the following week, to see whether that information traveled anywhere it shouldn't. It didn't. The shipment came through clean. Whatever else Wren Ashford was, she had told him the truth about not selling him out, and he found that the relief he felt at that confirmation was disproportionate to the amount of risk he'd actually taken to test it. The real storm broke 3 weeks later at his brother Nico's birthday dinner, in front of 11 members of the family's inner circle, when a second attempt was made. Not with a rifle this time, but with a glass of wine, a slow-acting compound that would have looked, to anyone without a trained eye, exactly like a man having a heart attack at 42. Wren caught it because she watched people's hands, always, more than their faces, and she saw the busboy's hand hesitate half a second too long over Alessio's glass before setting it down, a hesitation that meant nothing to anyone else at that table and meant everything to her. She didn't shout. She didn't draw a weapon in a room full of Contini family and half the Delacroix family's peace talk delegation. which would have started a war on the spot. She simply reached across the table, mid-conversation, laughing lightly at something someone had said, and swapped his glass for hers before he'd lifted it more than an inch off the tablecloth. She drank from it 20 minutes later, alone in the kitchen, testing it against her own body because there was no time to send it to a lab and no room for doubt. Alessio found her on the floor of the pantry 40 minutes after that, sweating, her pulse racing dangerously, having made herself vomit twice already, and refusing, even semi-conscious, to let anyone call an ambulance that would put a police report and a hospital record on top of a family already under federal scrutiny. He carried her to the car himself. He sat beside her in the back seat of a doctor's private clinic 3 hours later, holding her hand, while a physician who worked exclusively for families like his ran fluids into her arm and told Alessio, with the particular bluntness doctors reserved for men who paid extraordinarily well for discretion, that another 20 minutes without treatment, and she would not have survived it. He sat with her through the night. He didn't leave, not when Emmanuel came to update him on the busboy, already gone, already a dead end, hired through a staffing agency 2 days before the party under a name that didn't exist, and not when Nico came to apologize, badly, for a party that had nearly gotten his brother killed at his own birthday dinner. Alessio sat in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed that officially did not exist in any clinic's records, holding the hand of a woman who had drunk poison meant for him without asking his permission, and understood that whatever he had been telling himself this was, professional respect, gratitude, the ordinary loyalty a man feels toward good security, had stopped being true days, maybe weeks ago. She woke near dawn. The first thing she did, before she even opened her eyes fully, was try to sit up and ask if he was hurt, if the room was secure, if anyone had checked the perimeter of the clinic. He put his hand flat against her sternum, gently, and pushed her back down. "Everyone is secure," he said. "You almost died for me tonight, and the first thing out of your mouth is whether I'm hurt." "That's the job," she said, hoarse, her eyes finally focusing on his face. "No," he said. "It stopped being the job. I've had a dozen men die for me over the years, Wren. Good men. Loyal men. None of them ever looked at me the way you did tonight, and none of them were ever the reason I couldn't sleep." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something he hadn't let anyone hear in longer than he could remember. Not the voice of a man who ran an empire, but the voice of the boy who used to watch his father play chess alone in the study, before all of this made him armor himself against everything soft. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, the same way you did in that study 3 weeks ago." She waited. "If I told you right now to walk away," he said, "if I ended the contract, paid out whatever the federal case still owed you, made sure your brother's parole hearing went well regardless, no strings, no more risk, nothing left between us but the ordinary distance between two people who used to work together, would you go?" It was, on its surface, a question about loyalty, about the terms of a job, but he heard himself ask it and understood, even as the words were leaving his mouth, that it wasn't really a question about whether she'd leave. It was a question about whether he wanted her to stay for reasons that had stopped having anything to do with his safety, and the fact that his chest tightened, waiting for her answer, told him, with a clarity sharper than anything the doctor's blood panel had shown him that night, exactly what he was afraid the answer might be. Wren didn't answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, pale and exhausted, and still tethered to an IV line, and something in her face softened in a way he had never once seen. In 3 weeks of watching her guard every inch of herself as carefully as she guarded him. "No," she said finally. "I wouldn't go. And I think you already knew that. or you wouldn't have asked the question in a way that made it about whether I'd stay for you instead of whether the contract was over. He sat there with that answer for a long moment, the chess piece cold and forgotten in his coat pocket, and felt something inside his chest release that he had been holding tight since he was 26 years old, and buried his father in a grave he still couldn't visit without a security detail. It wasn't relief exactly. It was recognition, the specific, unmistakable recognition of loving someone, arriving not gently, but all at once, the way water finally breaks through a dam it's been pressing against for weeks. "I'm in love with you," he said, and it came out simpler than he expected it to. None of the practiced control he brought to every other sentence he'd spoken in 15 years of running a criminal empire. "I don't know when it happened. I think some part of me knew it the night you bled on my hands by that fountain and told me it wasn't about you. I've spent 3 weeks calling it something else because the alternative was terrifying, and I have not been terrified of anything in a very long time." She laughed weakly, the sound catching on something that might have been tears. "You're telling me this in a clinic that doesn't legally exist, while I'm hooked up to an IV because I drank your poison." "I'm telling you this," he said, "because I almost lost you tonight, and I would rather you know exactly what I am than trust a version of me that isn't real." He watched her recognize her own words handed back to her, watched something break open in her face that she had kept locked down since the first day she walked the perimeter of his house without introducing herself. "I meant what I said about ending the contract, not because I want you to go, because I don't want the reason you stay to ever be an obligation again. I want it to be a choice, made by someone who has nowhere else she has to be." In the days after the clinic, before the war on the docks reached its final, bloody shape, something shifted inside the house that even the men who had worked for Alessio Contini for a decade could feel without being told what had caused it. He stopped taking meetings without her in the room. He stopped making decisions about the family's exposure to risk without first asking what she saw that his own people had missed. And more than once, Emmanuel Ruiz caught himself deferring to a woman he had hired 6 weeks earlier as a favor to nobody, because her read on a room, a route, a stranger's hesitation at a doorway had already proven sharper than instincts Emmanuel had spent 30 years refining. Nico, for his part, resented it for exactly as long as it took Wren to notice the second attempt on the family's docks, a full day before anyone else did, tracing an irregularity in a shipping manifest that 3 separate accountants had signed off on without blinking. After that, even Nico stopped calling her the Bodyguard behind her back. She never let the softening show in front of anyone but Alessio, and even with him, she guarded it carefully, as though tenderness were a door she'd trained herself for years to keep locked, the same way he had. There were nights, in the weeks before the docks, when he would find her still awake at 2 in the morning, walking the perimeter one more time out of habit rather than necessity, and he would stand at the window and watch her the way she had once watched him, cataloging, but for something entirely different than a threat. He started to understand, watching her, that her calm wasn't the absence of fear. It was fear, disciplined into stillness, the same discipline he had spent his whole adult life mistaking for coldness in himself. They were, he realized slowly, built from the same material. 2 people who had learned that survival meant never letting anyone see the exact place where they could be broken, until, without either of them quite choosing the moment, they had shown each other precisely that place, and neither one had run. The real war, the one with the Delacroix family, the one that had used Dario's murder and a busboy with poisoned wine as opening moves in a conflict that had been years in the making, did not end quietly, and it did not end without cost. It took another 6 weeks, a federal informant inside the Delacroix organization, that Wren's old contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office was persuaded, carefully and at some professional risk to himself, to help identify, and a final confrontation on the eastern docks that left 3 men dead, and Nico Contini with a bullet wound in his shoulder. He would carry the rest of his life as a reminder of how close his family had come to losing everything. Wren stood beside Alessio through all of it, not as hired security anymore, but as something the entire organization eventually stopped trying to name, because there wasn't a word in their world for a woman who had been offered an easy way out, and chosen, instead, to stay and fight for a man she'd only meant to protect. Her brother's sentence was reduced, in the end, not through the leverage the federal prosecutor had used against her, but through a legal team Alessio quietly funded and a mountain of evidence, gathered by Wren herself over 4 careful months, proving the original case against him had been built on testimony from a man who had since been discredited on 3 other convictions. He came home 8 months after the night Alessio asked her the question that changed both their lives, and the first thing he did, standing in the driveway of a house he'd only ever seen in photographs his sister had smuggled into a visiting room, was look at Alessio Contini for a long moment and ask him, flatly, whether he understood what his sister had risked to survive the last year of her life. Alessio told him the truth, the way Wren had taught him to, in a study 3 weeks after a shooting that should have ended everything. He told him he understood exactly what she had risked, because he had nearly lost her twice, and because he intended to spend whatever years he had left making sure it was worth what it cost her. If you loved watching Wren Ashford's quiet strength unravel Alessio Contini's cold control, make sure you hit that like button. We love bringing you these dark, intense stories of power, loyalty, and love that survives against every possible odd. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in Wren's shoes, sitting across that desk with nothing but the truth to protect you. And don't forget to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story.